The wrought-iron gates of Blackwood Manor rose like sentinels, a testament to a legacy of power forged in steel and time, a heritage that had weathered the passing of generations. As the obsidian limousine glided up the long, crunching gravel of the driveway, Corbin Hawthorne settled deeper into the plush leather, a slow, measured breath escaping his lips. The very sight of his ancestral home ignited a complex fire within him, a swirling vortex of wistful nostalgia, profound reverence, and the undeniable crushing weight of his obligations. It had been years, a lifetime it seemed, since he had last walked these grounds. Years he had poured into sculpting his own empire, carving a name for himself that echoed far beyond the ancient boundaries of his family's sprawling domain. And now he was making his return, not merely as a titan of industry, but as a husband. Beside him, Seraphina sat with an impeccable poise, her perfectly manicured fingers dancing an idle, silent tune upon the car's supple interior. She was a vision of cultivated elegance, a woman whose tastes were as refined as her expectations were high. The prospect of marrying into one of the nation's most formidable dynasties had thrilled her, yet as the manor loomed into view, her lips drew into a subtle, almost imperceptible purse. It was magnificent, of course, but to her discerning eye it felt antiquated. She had conjured visions of a sleek modern palace, an edifice that would mirror the dazzling opulence of the life she was destined to lead. Corbin registered the minute shift in her composure, but chose the path of silence. He had long ago learned that on matters of aesthetics, Seraphina's pronouncements were best left uncontested. She was a woman who possessed an unshakable certainty of her desires, and more often than not, the world reshaped itself to grant them. As the vehicle whispered to a stop before the imposing entrance, the estate's staff stood assembled in a flawless, welcoming line, a silent tableau awaiting the return of their master. He saw a few familiar faces in the ranks, loyal retainers who had been fixtures of the household since his own boyhood, but his gaze swept past them, searching for one presence in particular. Before his foot could touch the ground, the colossal oak doors swung inward, revealing two figures. His Aunt Genevieve stood, a pillar of regal authority, her piercing eyes conducting a swift head-to-toe appraisal. She had always been the unyielding spine of the family, the steadfast guardian of the Hawthorne name's immaculate reputation. At her side stood his elder brother, Griffin, a smirk playing on his lips that was equal parts welcome and playful mockery. Corbin emerged first, instinctively smoothing the lapels of his jacket before extending a hand to Seraphina. She accepted it with practiced grace, alighting from the car with the fluid confidence of a woman who had navigated 1,000 galas. The moment her heels sounded their sharp report against the stone, her eyes swept over the assembled staff, a look of detached, clinical curiosity in her gaze. It was Genevieve who broke the silence. "Corbin, it's a relief to have you home." Her voice was a tapestry of warmth, yet threaded with the cool steel of authority she never seemed to shed. Her eyes flickered to Seraphina for a brief, assessing moment before she offered a nod of acknowledgement. "And I presume this is your wife?" Corbin managed to smile. "Aunt Genevieve, Griffin, this is Seraphina." Seraphina's hand extended, her lips curving into the flawless smile of a seasoned socialite. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you both. Corbin has told me so much about you." Genevieve's handshake was firm, her head tilting in a silent, discerning evaluation. Griffin, by contrast, took her hand with a light touch, his smirk widening. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor, Seraphina. I trust you'll find it to your liking." She smiled back, though an unreadable quality shadowed her eyes. "It's certainly grand." Corbin's gaze drifted past them, still on its silent quest. And then he found her. Standing a few paces behind the main staff, set slightly apart, was Eleonora. Time had etched its gentle story upon her features, but she was fundamentally the same woman he carried in his memory, dignified, resilient. Her dark skin was a canvas of experience, but her presence was a constant, comforting anchor. She stood with that quiet grace that was her signature, dressed in her simple, impeccable uniform, her hands clasped before her. Yet within her eyes, a deep warmth bloomed just for him. He took a deliberate step forward. "Eleonora!" The way her face illuminated, the way the corners of her mouth lifted in that knowing, affectionate smile, it caused something deep in his chest to clench. "My boy," she said, her voice a steady, resonant chord of emotion. "You're home." Without a second thought, Corbin bridged the remaining distance, enveloping her in a heartfelt embrace. She smelled of lavender and of safety, of comfort and the sun-drenched memories of his youth. She patted his back with a familiar, gentle rhythm, the same gesture she'd used to soothe him as a boy after a scraped knee or a terrifying nightmare. Serafina observed this exchange with an expression bordering on astonishment. She had never witnessed Corbin embrace anyone with such unreserved warmth, not even his own blood relatives. He was a man of measured gestures, of carefully calibrated interactions. But here, with this aging servant, all his defenses seemed to melt away. When they finally separated, Eleonora took a small step back, her eyes full of pride. "You've grown into such a fine man." Corbin chuckled, a genuine easy sound. "I should hope so. Though I suspect you'd still set me straight if I needed it." "That I would," she conceded, a playful twinkle lighting her eyes. Genevieve watched the reunion with a quiet, knowing approval, but Griffin's gaze darted toward Serafina. He saw the poorly masked confusion on her face, the way her lips were pressed together just a fraction too tightly. A small smirk touched his lips, as if he could already hear the distant thunder of an approaching storm. Corbin turned back to his wife, his hand coming to rest on the small of her back. "Eleonora, this is my wife, Serafina." Eleonora nodded, her expression polite and open. "Welcome, madam." Serafina paused for the briefest of moments, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, before she offered a small, rehearsed smile. "Thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you." The handshake that followed was perfunctory, but in that fleeting contact, Eleonora's expression subtly shifted. Serafina's grip was cool, her touch ephemeral, her gaze distant, and just as quickly the moment was over. Griffin leaned in, his voice a low murmur, meant only for Corbin. Well, that was a fascinating introduction. Corbin shot him a warning look, but his brother only grinned, a silent, "I told you so" in his eyes. As they moved inside, Serafina's gaze roamed across the cavernous interior. The manor was undeniably majestic, but it possessed an old-world grandeur that clashed with her vision of contemporary luxury. The soaring ceilings, the dark, heavy wood of the furniture, the intricately woven tapestries, it felt less like a home and more like a museum. For Corbin, however, it was an entirely different experience. This was the place that had shaped him, the halls where he had been raised. Every room was a vessel of memory, every corridor a whisper from his past. And at the very heart of so many of those memories stood Eleonora. As the great doors sealed them inside, Serafina let out a slow, deliberate breath. Her eyes flickered toward Corbin before settling for a telling moment on Eleonora. She uttered no word, but in that instant a silent, unspoken declaration passed through her eyes. It was the genesis of something neither Corbin nor Eleonora could yet comprehend. But Griffin saw it. Genevieve saw it, and soon Corbin would have no choice but to see it too. The great hall of Blackwood Manor thrummed with the quiet, purposeful energy of approaching evening. A golden luminescence from the grand chandeliers spilled across the polished hardwood floors, glinting off the gilded frames of ancestral portraits that stood silent watch along the walls. The preparations for dinner were underway, and the rich scent of roasting herbs and savory meat drifted from the kitchens, weaving itself into the crisp night air that whispered through the slightly ajar windows. It was an atmosphere that had always felt like home to Corbin, a place steeped in tradition and belonging. But tonight, for the very first time, a subtle dissonance hung in the air, a tension so finely spun it was almost intangible. Corbin sat in the drawing-room, his gaze drifting between the dancing flames in the hearth and Serafina, who stood by the grand piano, her fingers tracing a silent melody across its glossy surface. She had been unusually quiet since their arrival, but it was not the silence of peaceful contemplation. It was a weighted silence, one of judgment, of meticulous observations solidifying into conclusions she had not yet deigned to share. "You've said almost nothing since we arrived," Corbin finally observed, his eyes watchful. Serafina turned, her expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. "I'm simply absorbing it all," she replied, her voice smooth as silk. "Your home is very traditional." The slight hesitation before that final word was deliberate, a precisely aimed dart. Corbin exhaled through his nose, a faint knowing smile touching his lips. "That's a very diplomatic way of saying you find it obsolete, isn't it?" She offered no denial. Instead, her gaze wandered the room once more, before returning to him. "It has a great deal of history, I'll grant you that, and a certain charm." Corbin studied her, easily deciphering the careful diplomacy of her words. He knew Serafina well enough to understand she was tempering the full force of her opinions. Perhaps it was a concession to how much this place meant to him, or perhaps she was merely waiting for the opportune moment to present her views not as criticism, but as a gentle, necessary push toward transformation. A soft rap on the door broke the charged silence. A moment later, Eleonora entered, her presence as grounding and composed as the ancient oaks outside. She was dressed in her customary simple, neat uniform, her posture imbued with an effortless grace. The warmth in her eyes as she looked at Corbin was unmistakable, but there was something else present as well, a quiet, steady observation of Serafina, a moment of silent appraisal. "Dinner is served," Eleonora announced, her voice possessing the same calm assurance it had held throughout his life. Corbin nodded and rose to his feet. "Thank you, Eleonora." Serafina remained motionless for a beat longer, then offered a small smile that was almost blindingly bright. "That was remarkably quick. Your staff is quite efficient." Eleonora inclined her head in a small, respectful gesture. "We endeavor to do our best, madam." Corbin did not fail to notice the fractional pause before Serafina followed him from the room. It was a subtle thing, a detail most would overlook, but Corbin had built an empire on his ability to read people, to understand the nuanced shifts in their expressions, the hidden weight behind their words. And what he saw in that fleeting moment was not warmth, not even polite disinterest. It was something colder, something far more distant. The dining room was a portrait of perfection, just as it always was for family gatherings. The long mahogany table gleamed under the soft candlelight. The silverware was arranged with a geometric precision, and the plates were adorned with culinary masterpieces. The family was already seating themselves as Corbin and Serafina entered. Genevieve occupied her customary place at the head of the table, her sharp eyes flickering with quiet scrutiny as she watched Serafina. Griffin lounged a few seats away, his ever-present smirk suggesting he was privately amused by the evening's unfolding drama. Corbin held Serafina's chair for her before taking his own. Eleonora, as she had done for countless years, made a final check to ensure everything was perfect before settling into the chair that had always been reserved for her. Serafina saw it. For a moment she said nothing, her face a carefully blank canvas as she lifted her wineglass. But when she spoke, her voice was light, almost playful, yet the words themselves were tipped with poison. "I must say, I wasn't aware that the staff dines with the family." A brief, heavy silence descended upon the table. Corbin's hand tightened imperceptibly around his fork. Genevieve's gaze sharpened. Griffin, ever the observer, leaned back in his chair, a flicker of dark amusement in his eyes. Eleonora, however, showed no outward reaction. She simply met Serafina's gaze with the same unwavering patience that had seen her through decades of service to this household. "I have been a part of the Hawthorne family for a very long time, madam. This has always been our way." Serafina tilted her head, a picture of innocent curiosity. "How interesting," she murmured, taking a delicate sip of her wine. "I suppose every family has its unique traditions." Corbin exhaled slowly, setting his glass down with deliberate care. "Eleonora is more than staff, Serafina. She practically raised me." "Of course," Serafina said, her tone perfectly smooth. "That's what makes it so different. It's just not something I am accustomed to." Eleonora inclined her head slightly, as if accepting the flimsy explanation, though Corbin knew she understood the venomous subtext as clearly as he did. The conversation shifted, then veering into safer waters. Genevieve questioned Corbin about his latest business ventures. Griffin made a few teasing remarks about his younger brother's return to the fold. But through it all, Corbin would catch Serafina's gaze flickering toward Eleonora, studying her with that same cool, appraising look. By the time the meal concluded, the atmosphere had settled into something quieter, but the undercurrent of tension was now a palpable force. Corbin couldn't precisely define it, but he could feel it, a subtle but profound shift, a new and dangerous dynamic that had not existed before. As the plates were cleared and the family began to disperse, Corbin lingered in the dining room, watching as Eleonora gathered the last of the crystal glasses. She paused when she noticed him, her expression as serene as ever, but he could sense the unspoken thoughts beneath the surface. "She's just adjusting," Corbin said, though the words felt hollow even to him. Eleonora offered him a small, knowing smile. "New places, new faces. It requires time." But Corbin had the distinct and unsettling feeling that all the time in the world wouldn't change whatever had just been set in motion. When he found Serafina in their chambers later that night, she was standing by the window, gazing out at the vast, dark expanse of the estate. He came up behind her, placing a hand lightly on her waist. "You were very quiet at dinner," he said softly. She glanced over her shoulder, her lips curving into a soft, enigmatic smile. "Just absorbing it all," she repeated. Corbin let the silence hang between them for a moment before nodding. Neither spoke further, but the unsaid words resonated in the space between them, a silent weight settling into the very air of the room. Something had irrevocably shifted tonight, and though Corbin couldn't yet give it a name, he knew with a chilling certainty that this was only the beginning. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows of Blackwood Manor, painting long golden stripes across the gleaming floors. The house was already humming with quiet purpose. Servants moved with silent efficiency. The faint music of silverware echoed from the breakfast room, and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee wound its way through the grand hallways. Corbin awoke early, stretching as he reacquainted himself with the familiar, yet now distant comfort of his childhood bedroom. He glanced at Serafina's side of the bed. She was still deep in slumber, a cascade of golden hair spread across the silk pillowcase, her breathing even and slow. He dressed without a sound, a sudden urge compelling him to walk the grounds before the day truly began. The air outside was cool and crisp, carrying the clean scent of morning dew, mingled with the delicate perfume of the flowers blooming in the gardens. The estate was immense, acres of manicured land rolling toward the horizon, the same land where he had once sprinted as a boy, his laughter chasing the summer wind. He had spent innumerable mornings just like this one, with Eleonora walking steadfastly by his side, her voice weaving tales of magic and wonder into the fabric of the day. As he wandered in the direction of the gardens, he caught the low murmur of voices coming from the nearby sitting room. He slowed his pace, pausing just out of sight in the doorway. Inside, Serafina stood near a side table, examining a silver-framed photograph. Eleonora was nearby, adjusting the heavy velvet curtains, her movements possessing the same unhurried grace that always defined her. The atmosphere wasn't overtly hostile, but a carefully controlled restraint hung in the air, a quiet undercurrent that Corbin could sense even from the hall. "This house is so saturated with history," Serafina commented, tilting her head as she scrutinized the photograph. It was an old image of Corbin as a boy, no older than 7 or 8, perched in the grand library with a book far too large for his small hands. Beside him sat Eleonora, her warm, watchful eyes filled with affection as he focused on the pages. It was a memory Corbin treasured, one of countless moments when Eleonora had been more of a mother to him than his own had ever been. "Yes, madam," Eleonora replied with quiet dignity. "It has been a home to many generations." Serafina's lips curved into a smile that failed to ignite her eyes. "I suppose some things are destined to remain the same," she mused, placing the frame back on the table, "though I do imagine certain things could benefit from an update." There was a pause, just a fraction of a second too long to be comfortable. Eleonora said nothing, simply continuing her task, her face an unreadable mask. "These old portraits, for instance," Serafina went on, her gaze sweeping the walls. "They lend the house such a museum-like quality, don't you find?" Eleonora's eyes briefly followed her gaze, her expression remaining perfectly neutral. "They are a part of the family's heritage, madam." Serafina let out a soft, dismissive hum, as if she found the sentiment charmingly quaint. She turned away, trailing her fingers over a mahogany credenza. "I shall have to speak with Corbin about it," she said, almost to herself. "A home should be a reflection of its current owners, after all." It was at that moment Corbin chose to enter, making his presence known. Serafina turned at the sound of his footsteps, her face breaking into a slow, languid smile. "Good morning," she said. "I was just admiring some of the artifacts around the house. This estate truly does cling to its past, doesn't it?" Corbin's eyes flickered to the photograph she had been holding, then to Eleonora, who met his gaze for a brief, telling instant before resuming her work. He understood precisely what was unfolding, despite Serafina's light conversational tone. "Some things are worth clinging to," he replied simply. Serafina's smile never wavered, but a fleeting shadow crossed her eyes. "Of course," she said smoothly. "I was merely observing how some traditions can be quite charming, while others, well, they can make a house feel trapped in time." Corbin remained silent, his gaze steady on her. After a beat, she moved closer, placing a light kiss on his cheek. "I'll meet you at breakfast," she murmured, before sweeping out of the room. The silence she left behind was heavy. Corbin turned to Eleonora, searching her face for any trace of distress, but she was as composed as ever. "She will grow accustomed to our ways," he said, though even to his own ears the words sounded like a hollow excuse. Eleonora gave him a small knowing smile. "Change can be a lengthy process," she replied simply, before moving on to her next duty. By the time breakfast was served, the family was assembled in the dining room. The morning light filtered through the towering windows, illuminating the immaculate table settings and the artful arrangements of fruit, pastries, and steaming carafes. Genevieve sat with her usual poised elegance, sipping her tea while her assessing gaze moved from person to person. Griffin, perpetually relaxed, leaned back in his chair, stirring sugar into his coffee with an air of detached amusement. Serafina was in a remarkably buoyant mood, speaking animatedly about their plans, suggesting a potential renovation of several rooms. "Nothing too drastic, of course," she assured the table, her tone perfectly pleasant. "Just a few modern touches to elevate the space." Genevieve raised a skeptical eyebrow but held her tongue, while Griffin merely smirked over the rim of his cup. Eleonora, as always, moved through the room with a silent efficiency, ensuring everyone's needs were met. And then it happened. A sudden, sharp movement, a flick of a wrist, and a glass of deep red wine tipped over. The crimson liquid bled across the pristine white tablecloth, its dark stream splashing directly onto Eleonora's uniform. A small, sharp intake of breath was heard, but Eleonora did not flinch. She simply took a half step back, her eyes briefly on the spreading stain, before she calmly reached for a napkin. "Oh my," Serafina said, her voice light with feigned concern. "How clumsy of me." The words were delivered with such practiced ease, such effortless insincerity, that the very air in the room seemed to crystallize. Corbin stared at the scene, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Griffin's smirk vanished, his eyes flicking to his brother, waiting. Genevieve set her teacup down with deliberate, sharp precision, her eyes like chips of ice. Eleonora gently dabbed at the stain, her movements slow and methodical. "It is quite all right, madam," she said evenly. "Accidents happen." Serafina tilted her head slightly, watching Eleonora with that same unreadable, detached expression. "Yes," she said. "They do." Corbin felt a strange constriction in his throat. He should have spoken. He should have told Serafina to be more careful, to offer a genuine apology, to acknowledge that this was no mere accident. But the words remained lodged in his throat. He sat in silence, watching as Eleonora excused herself from the room with her quiet, unshakable dignity. As the door swung shut behind her, the full weight of the moment descended upon Corbin. The unease he had been trying to suppress for days was now a roaring fire in his gut. Genevieve glanced at him, her expression glacial. "You really should be more careful with your wine, Serafina," she said, her voice laced with an unmistakable edge. Serafina only smiled, lifting her glass once more. "I will certainly try to be more mindful," she replied smoothly. Griffin let out a quiet sigh, shaking his head as he leaned back. Corbin sat in mute silence. His fingers curled so tightly around the stem of his glass he thought it might shatter. The words were on his tongue, but they never left his mouth. And in that silence, something broke. The afternoon passed in a strange, oppressive quiet. The tension from the breakfast table had permeated the estate, a heavy invisible shroud that thickened the air with unspoken accusations and undeniable truths. Corbin had sought refuge in work, retreating to his father's old study, a sanctuary lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and saturated with the scent of aged leather and polished mahogany. Yet, no matter how he tried to immerse himself in documents and figures, his mind kept replaying the scene in the dining room, the dark wine blooming on Eleonora's crisp uniform, the chilling politeness in Serafina's voice, and his own damning silence. He had tried to reason with himself, to believe that Serafina had meant nothing by it, that the spill was a genuine accident. But her smile afterward, the cool, satisfied look she had given Eleonora, there was a deliberate, calculated cruelty in it. And Eleonora's reaction was just as telling. She hadn't been flustered or angry. She had simply cleaned the stain and departed, as if she had already anticipated such an attack and knew that protesting would be futile. Corbin exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. He needed to find Eleonora, to speak with her, to ensure she was all right. But before he could rise, a soft knock sounded against the heavy wooden doors. "Come in," he called out. The door creaked open, and Genevieve entered, her expression unreadable as she closed it firmly behind her. She moved to the small bar cart in the corner, pouring a small measure of sherry before turning to face him. "You've been hiding in here all day," she stated, her voice calm but sharp. Corbin sighed. "Just trying to get some work done." Genevieve took a slow sip, then set her glass down with a precise click. "Or are you trying to avoid confronting what is happening under your own roof?" Corbin's jaw tightened. He had been dreading this conversation, though he knew it was inevitable. "What do you want me to say, Aunt Genevieve?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. She studied him for a long moment, then moved closer, taking the seat opposite his desk. "I want you to say something, Corbin. Anything. I want you to acknowledge that what transpired at breakfast was no accident, that your wife's behavior toward Eleonora has been nothing short of disgraceful." He didn't answer right away, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the desk as his mind scrambled for the right words, the right defense. But Genevieve's gaze was too piercing. He knew she could see the conflict warring within him. "Serafina doesn't understand our ways here," he finally managed. "She wasn't raised in a home like this, with staff who are treated as part of the family. She is still adapting." Genevieve let out a sharp, incredulous breath, shaking her head. "That is a pathetic excuse, Corbin. Adapting is one thing. Humiliating an elderly woman who has devoted her entire life to this family is something else entirely." The sting of her words was sharp, but he held her gaze. "What would you have me do? Confront my wife over a spilled glass of wine?" Genevieve's expression hardened into granite. "I want you to open your eyes before it is too late." She stood, smoothing the creases from her dress. "Eleonora will not complain. She never does. But that does not mean she is not hurting. And if you continue to stand by in silence, Corbin, you will live to regret it." She departed without another word, leaving him alone with the suffocating silence and the crushing weight of everything he had refused to see. That evening, dinner was a far more subdued affair. The family gathered as usual, but the atmosphere was strained, as if everyone was bracing for the next blow. Corbin sat at the head of the table, his mind elsewhere, his appetite gone. Serafina, in contrast, was as poised as ever, effortlessly steering the conversation, seemingly untouched by the events of the morning. Eleonora moved about the room, serving with her usual quiet professionalism, but Corbin noticed a weariness in her eyes he had never seen before. Then, just as the meal was drawing to a close, Serafina struck again. As Eleonora reached across the table to refill her water glass, Serafina let out a soft, theatrical gasp and jerked her arm, causing the glass to overturn. The clear liquid spilled once more, this time drenching Eleonora's hand and the front of her uniform. A sharp intake of breath came from the other end of the table. The silence that followed was absolute. "Oh, dear," Serafina murmured, placing a hand over her heart in a gesture of mock surprise. "I really must be more careful." Eleonora froze for only a split second before she straightened, dabbing at the fresh stain with her napkin. "It is quite all right, madam," she said softly, her voice unwavering. But it wasn't all right. It wasn't all right at all. A hot surge of anger, an emotion he hadn't felt so intensely in years, rose in Corbin's chest. He opened his mouth, ready to finally say something, to end this cruel charade. But then he hesitated, and in that fatal moment of hesitation, the opportunity was lost. Eleonora excused herself, moving with that same quiet dignity as she left the room. The door clicked shut behind her, and the remaining silence was suffocating. Genevieve set down her fork with a sharp clatter, her eyes blazing with a barely contained fury. "That is enough." Serafina blinked at her, feigning innocence. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me," Genevieve said, her voice like ice. "I do not know what sort of behavior is deemed acceptable in your world, Serafina, but in this house we do not treat the people who raised us like refuse." Serafina's lips parted slightly, as if shocked by the force of Genevieve's words. But then she let out a soft, airy laugh and shook her head. "Oh, do be serious," she said lightly. "It was an accident. There is no need for such melodrama." Griffin, who had been a silent observer until now, finally spoke, his voice laced with quiet contempt. "You have quite a knack for accidents, don't you?" Serafina's gaze snapped toward him, her expression momentarily flashing with something cold and sharp before it vanished. She looked back at Corbin, her eyes searching his, daring him to choose a side. For a long, agonizing moment he said nothing. Then finally he exhaled and reached for his wineglass. "Let's not escalate this into something it isn't," he said, his voice measured, neutral. Genevieve's expression darkened with profound disappointment. Griffin shook his head slowly, and Serafina, victorious, smiled. Corbin took a slow sip of his wine, but it tasted like ash on his tongue. Because deep down he knew it already was something, and he had just allowed it to happen again. The house had never felt so heavy, so suffocating. The once familiar halls, which had always echoed with warmth, now seemed to carry an air of profound unease, a quiet, creeping tension that had seeped into the very stone and timber of the manor. Corbin had spent the better part of the day in a state of deliberate avoidance, trying to outrun the gnawing feeling in his chest. He buried himself in paperwork, sought solace in the stables, and walked the farthest edges of the estate, all in a desperate attempt to evade the truth that was closing in on him like a thick, choking fog. But no matter his efforts, the memory of the previous night played on a loop in his mind. The way the wine had soaked Eleonora's uniform, the quiet dignity with which she had excused herself, the triumphant smile on Serafina's face, and worst of all, his own deafening silence. As he passed through the main hall that afternoon, he found Griffin leaning against the grand staircase, arms crossed, watching him with an expression of knowing pity. "You look troubled, little brother," Griffin mused, pushing himself off the railing. "Could it be that you're finally realizing your wife is a viper?" Corbin shot him a glare. "Not now, Griffin." "Oh, but when exactly?" Griffin fell into step beside him as he walked toward the study. "Because if you wait much longer, you won't just lose your dignity. You'll lose Eleonora, too." Corbin stopped mid-stride, his brother's words striking him with the force of a physical blow. But he forced himself to keep moving, unwilling to have this conversation. Not now. Griffin let out a weary sigh, his gaze softening slightly. "You were always the one who cared too much about keeping the peace," he said. "But tell me, Corbin, does this feel peaceful to you right now?" Corbin offered no reply as he entered the study and shut the door firmly behind him. The evening arrived far too quickly, and with it the dread of another dinner. The moment he stepped into the dining room, Corbin could feel the weight of their collective gazes. Genevieve's sharp scrutiny, Griffin's silent, cynical amusement, and Serafina's poised indifference. And then there was Eleonora. She moved through the room with her customary quiet grace, her face a mask of professionalism, betraying nothing. But Corbin knew better. He saw the subtle signs of exhaustion, the quiet resignation of someone who was enduring, as she always had. But for how much longer? Serafina had barely touched her meal before she set down her fork and turned to Corbin with a saccharine smile. "I was thinking," she began, her voice light and airy, "it's time we instituted some changes around here." Corbin took a slow sip of his wine. "What kind of changes?" "Well," Serafina gestured vaguely at their surroundings, "it's no secret that this house is, how should I put it, stuck in a bygone era. There's so much we could do to modernize it." Genevieve's expression remained unchanged, but a new tension settled in her shoulders. Griffin raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Corbin placed his glass down with care. "It's an old house, Serafina. It has history." "Yes, of course," she said smoothly, "and I respect that. But there are still some elements that could be updated. For instance, the staff's quarters. It seems a bit archaic, doesn't it, that they are still situated so close to the main wing." A chilling silence fell over the room. Eleonora's hand paused for a fraction of a second as she set down a fresh platter. Griffin let out a low, disbelieving chuckle, shaking his head. "Oh, this is rich." Corbin exhaled slowly. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm merely saying," Serafina continued, toying with the stem of her glass, "that perhaps it's time we reconsidered certain arrangements. This house is meant to be a home, not a museum. And frankly, I just don't see why some traditions need to be preserved." Genevieve set down her fork with a quiet, deliberate clink. "Serafina," she said, her voice dangerously cool, "I don't believe you grasp the nature of this household." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Serafina countered sweetly. "I just think it's obsolete." Eleonora remained silent, a statue at the edge of the room, but Corbin could feel the weight of her presence. The air was thick, suffocating. Serafina was making her intentions brutally clear. She wanted Eleonora gone. Corbin felt his throat tighten. "Eleonora has been here longer than any of us," he said finally. "She's family." Serafina tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "She is staff, Corbin." The finality of her words sent a shockwave through the room. Eleonora did not flinch, did not react, but Corbin, who knew her so well, saw the faintest shift in her posture, the way her fingers curled almost imperceptibly at her sides. Genevieve was watching him now, waiting. Griffin was leaning back, a spectator at a grim spectacle. And Corbin? Corbin said nothing, not because he lacked the words, but because in that horrifying moment he realized something profound. If he spoke up, if he fought for Eleonora, it would mean open war. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he possessed the strength to fight it. The meal continued, but the damage was done. Later that night, long after the house had fallen into a troubled quiet, Corbin found himself aimlessly wandering the halls. His feet, acting on some deep subconscious impulse, carried him to Eleonora's quarters. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of soft lamplight spilling onto the wooden floor. He knocked softly. A pause, and then her voice calm as ever. "Come in." He stepped inside. The room was modest but comfortable, filled with the small artifacts of a life lived in service and love. A stack of neatly folded quilts, a framed photograph of him as a boy sitting beside her on the front steps. The air smelled of lavender and something warm, something safe. Eleonora was seated in a chair by the window, gazing out at the darkened estate. She turned to him with that same quiet, knowing look, the one that had always held more understanding than words ever could. Corbin hesitated. "Are you all right?" Eleonora smiled, but it was a weary smile, tinged with sadness. "I've weathered worse, my boy." He ran a hand through his hair, a long, frustrated exhale escaping him. "I don't know what to do." She watched him for a long moment before speaking. "You already know what to do," she said softly. "You are simply afraid to do it." He swallowed, the familiar weight in his chest growing heavier, more constricting with each passing day. Eleonora reached out then, placing a gentle hand over his. "You were always such a good boy," she murmured. "I know you still are." Corbin closed his eyes for a brief second, the warmth of her touch a temporary anchor. But when he opened them, he knew. He knew what was coming, and he knew that if he didn't make a choice, and soon he would lose something far more valuable than his pride. The days that followed were a strange, heavy blur. Corbin felt as though he were moving through a dream, watching his life from a great distance, detached and paralyzed by indecision. His mind was a relentless theater, replaying every missed opportunity, every unspoken word, every damning silence he had allowed to fester. The estate stood as grand and imposing as ever, its halls filled with the familiar rhythms of life, footsteps on polished floors, the distant hum of conversation, the clatter of silverware. But underneath it all, a current of tension ran deep, an unease so pervasive that even the staff moved with a new caution, as if trying to make themselves invisible. Corbin spent his time in the periphery, retreating to his study, lingering in the stables, walking the far boundaries of the property in quiet, tormented contemplation. He was doing anything and everything to avoid looking directly at the truth that had settled over him like a thick, suffocating blanket. But the truth does not wait patiently. It does not allow itself to be ignored, and it came crashing down on him one evening in the most public and brutal way imaginable. The Hawthorne family was hosting a formal gathering, an event designed to properly introduce Serafina to their extended family and close circle of friends. It was a time-honored tradition, one that Corbin had grown up with and never given much thought. But tonight, standing in the grand ballroom as guests in shimmering gowns and tailored tuxedos filled the space, he felt nothing but a profound exhaustion. The stone in his chest had not lifted, no matter how many times he told himself to push forward, that things would eventually settle. Serafina, of course, was in her natural element. She drifted through the crowd with an effortless, predatory grace, exchanging pleasantries, offering polished smiles, and laughing lightly at all the right moments. To any outside observer, she was the consummate hostess, the poised and elegant new mistress of Blackwood Manor. Corbin watched her from across the room, a glass of whiskey in hand, and wondered how he had ever failed to see it before, the way she could so easily transform, slipping into whatever role the situation demanded. He had once found her adaptability impressive. Now it deeply unsettled him. The evening wore on, a symphony of conversation and laughter, but Corbin remained a ghost at the feast. He spoke when spoken to, nodded when appropriate, but his mind was 1,000 miles away. It was only when he caught sight of Eleonora across the room that the numbness in his chest finally began to crack. She was not dressed for the occasion, of course, nor was she a part of the celebration. She moved through the space with her usual silent efficiency, ensuring that everything was in its place, that the guests were comfortable, that the evening unfolded without a flaw. And yet, even in her quiet servitude, she commanded a presence that Corbin could not ignore. He was about to move toward her when he saw it begin. Serafina was standing with a small group which included a few of Corbin's oldest acquaintances. For the first time all evening, her expression was something less than warm. He couldn't hear the initial exchange, but he saw the slight, contemptuous curl of her lip and the way the guests around her reacted, some shifting uncomfortably, others smiling in that predatory way people do when they smell blood in the water. And then came the laughter. It was soft, restrained, but unmistakably cruel. Corbin's stomach clenched as he moved closer, his ears catching the tail end of Serafina's sentence. Really, I just don't understand how certain things haven't been updated here. Clinging to the past is one thing, but at some point one must recognize when something is no longer necessary. A woman beside her, Marissa, a longtime family friend, shifted her weight. You mean the house itself? Oh, not just the house, Serafina said smoothly. I mean certain traditions, certain people. Marissa's smile faltered, and Corbin felt the slow, sickening realization of where this was headed. Someone else in the group, Gabriel, another familiar face, let out a condescending chuckle. You're referring to the old maid. Serafina neither confirmed nor denied the statement. She simply took a delicate sip of her wine, letting the silence deliver the verdict. And that was when Corbin saw Eleonora. She had paused just a few feet away, holding a silver tray, her back ramrod straight. For a moment she did nothing. She did not react. She did not flinch. But Corbin saw it, the way her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the tray, the briefest flicker of profound pain in her expression before it was masked once more. A slow simmering rage began to boil in Corbin's veins. Before he could think, before he could rationalize, he was moving. "Excuse me," he said, his voice sharp, cutting through the conversation like a blade. The small group turned toward him. Serafina's expression barely changed. If anything, there was a faint trace of satisfaction in her eyes. "Corbin," she greeted smoothly, as if nothing was amiss. "We were just discussing enough?" The word escaped his lips before he even realized he had spoken it. The chatter around them died. Corbin turned his cold gaze on the others. "This is not the kind of discussion that will ever take place in my home again." Gabriel looked momentarily abashed. Marissa took a slow step back. Serafina, however, simply tilted her head. "Darling, I was only making an observation. I said, enough." This time the words were sharper, colder. For the first time all evening, something in Serafina's polished facade flickered. Corbin turned then, his eyes locking with Eleonora's. "I apologize," he said quietly, so only she could hear. Eleonora studied him for a long, searching moment, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "I should return to my duties, sir." He wanted to stop her, to say more, but she had already turned and melted back into the crowd. Corbin remained standing there, the gravity of what had just occurred settling over him like a shroud. Serafina was watching him now, her gaze sharp, assessing. That was quite a reaction, she mused. Corbin exhaled slowly, turning to face her fully. "You humiliated her." "I did no such thing. You knew exactly what you were doing." Serafina's lips curled into a slight, venomous smile. "And you knew exactly what you were marrying." The words were spoken softly, but they struck him with the force of a physical blow. For the first time, he truly saw her, not the woman he had once admired, not the carefully crafted socialite, but the person who resided beneath it all. And what he saw made something deep inside him shatter. He had made a catastrophic mistake, and now he had to decide what he was going to do about it. The rest of the night dragged on in a distorted haze, a meaningless murmur of conversations and the distant clinking of glasses. For Corbin, everything had blurred. The realization sat in his chest like a block of ice, pressing down, making it difficult to breathe. The way Serafina had looked at him, the triumphant smile that played on her lips as she delivered those final, devastating words, "You knew exactly what you were marrying," had stripped away the last vestiges of his illusions. He had spent far too long in denial, too long convincing himself that her sharp-edged remarks were mere misunderstandings, that her cold indifference toward Eleonora was simply a product of an unfamiliar environment. But it wasn't. Serafina knew precisely what she was doing. And worse, she savored it. Without another word, Corbin turned and left the ballroom. He could hear the faint strains of music and laughter behind him, the party continuing as if nothing had happened. But it no longer mattered. He needed air. He needed to escape. The halls of the estate were silent as he walked, his footsteps a lonely echo against the marble floor. The weight of his silence from the past weeks pressed in on him, each unspoken word a source of suffocation. He had failed Eleonora. He had stood by and allowed this to happen. And now, as much as he wished he could rewind time, he knew there was only one path forward. He stopped outside the sitting room where he had last seen her and pushed the door open. The space was empty. The fire in the hearth burned down to glowing embers. A tray sat on a side table, the tea on it long since gone cold. Corbin let out a slow, ragged breath, rubbing a hand over his face. He was too late. A voice from the doorway made him turn. "So, you finally figured it out." Griffin stood there, arms crossed, watching him with an expression that was a mixture of cynical amusement and deep disappointment. Corbin exhaled sharply. "Not now, Griffin." Griffin stepped into the room, leaning casually against the back of an armchair. "Oh, I think now is the perfect time," he said. "You're finally seeing her for who she really is, aren't you?" Corbin didn't answer. Griffin let out a short, mirthless laugh, shaking his head. "God, Corbin, I knew you were blind, but this... You let her treat Eleonora like she was nothing, and you just stood there." "I know," Corbin muttered, the words tasting like poison. "Do you?" Griffin raised an eyebrow. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're just now catching up to what the rest of us saw from the moment she arrived. Corbin turned away, staring into the dying flames. I made a mistake. No, Griffin corrected, his voice losing its mocking edge. You made a series of mistakes, but at least you finally see it. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Corbin clenched his fists. I'm going to fix it. Griffin studied him for a long moment before nodding. Then do it quickly, because if you don't, she'll be gone before you get the chance. The words sent a chill down his spine. Corbin left the sitting room and moved with newfound purpose toward Eleonora's quarters. His heart hammered against his ribs, his pulse quickening with each step. The thought of losing her, of allowing her to be driven from the home she had dedicated her life to, was unbearable. He reached her door and hesitated for only a second before knocking. Silence. He knocked again, more urgently this time. Finally the door opened. Eleonora stood before him, already dressed in a simple traveling coat, a small suitcase resting by her side. Her expression was calm, but there was a finality in her eyes that stole the air from his lungs. His throat tightened. "You're leaving?" Eleonora nodded slowly. "Yes," he stared at her, words failing him. He had known this was coming, had felt it in his bones, but seeing it manifest was something else entirely. "You don't have to go," he said finally, his voice quiet. Eleonora offered a sad, gentle smile, one that held a lifetime of understanding. "My dear boy," she murmured, "I stayed as long as I was needed. But it appears I am no longer welcome." Corbin took a step closer, his chest constricting. "That's not true. You are welcome. This is your home." She looked at him then, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Is it?" The question hit him with more force than any accusation could have. She took a slow breath, her voice gentle but firm. "A home is a place where you are respected, where you are valued. I have spent my life here, Corbin. I raised you. I loved you as if you were my own son. And yet I have been humiliated under this roof, treated as if I am less than nothing." Corbin swallowed hard. Eleonora continued, her words precise and true. "And the worst part of it all? It wasn't just Serafina, Corbin. It was you. Your silence hurt more than any word she could have ever said." The truth of her words was a searing brand. He had no defense, no excuse. "I was a coward," he admitted quietly. Eleonora studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Yes," she said simply. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair in agitation. "I don't want you to leave." She reached out then, placing a hand gently on his cheek, just as she had done when he was a boy. "Then prove it," she said softly. "Make this right. Not with words, but with actions." He nodded, his jaw tight. "I will." Eleonora lowered her hand and stepped back, picking up her suitcase. "Then I will wait to see if you do." With that, she turned and walked past him, moving down the hall with her quiet, unbreakable dignity, leaving him standing in the doorway with the crushing weight of his failure pressing down on him. For a long time, Corbin didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned on his heel and walked back toward the main house. The time for silence was over. When he entered their bedroom, Serafina was sitting at her vanity, carefully removing her diamond earrings. She met his gaze in the mirror, her lips curving into a smug smile. "Ah," she murmured, "I was wondering when you'd finally come to your senses." Corbin stepped forward, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. "Pack your things." Serafina blinked, her expression flickering with momentary surprise before hardening into something cold and sharp. "Excuse me?" "I said pack your things," Corbin repeated, his voice steady, final. "You're leaving." A short, breathless laugh escaped her lips. "You can't be serious." "I am." Serafina turned on her stool to face him fully, slowly rising to her feet. "And where precisely do you expect me to go?" Corbin exhaled, his patience worn to a thread. "I don't care. But you will not spend another night under this roof." She studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing. "All of this," she said slowly, "over a maid?" Corbin's jaw clenched. "Over Eleonora," he corrected. "Over you. Over everything you have done and everything I allowed you to do." Serafina's expression darkened into a mask of fury. "You will regret this, Corbin." "No," he said, shaking his head. For the first time in a very long time, I won't." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, her breath coming in sharp, angry hisses, her fury palpable in the air. As he walked out of the room, out of the house, and into the cool night air, Corbin felt a tremendous weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, he felt like himself again. But there was still one more thing left to do. He had to make things right. The morning light cast a soft golden glow over Blackwood Manor, but the house itself felt transformed. The very air seemed lighter. The oppressive weight that had settled over the halls for weeks had finally dissipated. Yet Corbin knew this was only the beginning of a long road. Serafina was gone. The news had rippled through the household with silent speed. No one spoke of it openly, but the staff, who had moved with such caution in her presence, now went about their duties with a quiet, palpable sense of relief. Genevieve, though she said little, had given him a long, approving nod over breakfast. Griffin had simply smirked, raising his coffee cup in a silent toast before muttering something about him finally growing a spine. But Corbin was not concerned with any of that. There was only one thing that mattered now. He stood outside, the cool morning breeze ruffling his shirt as he stared down the narrow road leading away from the estate. Eleonora had left the night before, her silhouette vanishing into the darkness. He had let her go, knowing she needed space, knowing her wounds were too deep to be healed by mere words of apology. But now he was going to bring her home. He didn't take a car. He didn't want the barrier, the cold separation of glass and steel. Instead, he walked. The road was intimately familiar, lined with the towering oaks whose branches swayed gently in the morning air. He remembered walking this same path as a child, Eleonora's hand holding his, her voice filling the quiet with soft stories and gentle wisdom. When he arrived at the small cottage on the outskirts of town, his heart clenched. It was a modest place, tucked away behind a slightly overgrown garden, but it was immaculately kept. Eleonora had always taken pride in her own space, in her independence. He hesitated for only a moment before raising his hand and knocking. The door opened slowly. Eleonora stood there, dressed in a simple blouse and a long skirt, her silver-streaked hair tied back neatly. She looked at him with an unreadable expression, waiting. Corbin exhaled. "May I come in?" She studied him for a long, searching moment before stepping aside, allowing him to enter. The inside of the cottage was warm and familiar. The scent of lavender lingered in the air, mixed with the faint aroma of freshly brewed tea. Corbin's gaze swept the room, taking in the small personal details, the carefully folded blankets, the framed photos of the estate, of him as a boy. His throat tightened. Eleonora moved to the small kitchen, pouring tea into 2 cups before placing them on the simple wooden table. She took a seat and gestured for him to do the same. He sat, his hands clasped together on the table. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a waiting silence. "I failed you," Corbin said finally, his voice low but steady. "For weeks, I allowed you to be treated as if you were insignificant, and I did nothing to stop it. I saw it happening. I knew it was wrong, and I still refused to speak." Eleonora's eyes did not waver. "I let her make you feel as though you didn't belong in that house," he continued. "But you do. You always have. And I despise myself for taking this long to say it." Eleonora was quiet for a long moment. Then she sighed, setting her cup down with careful precision. "You were always a good boy, Corbin," she said softly. "But sometimes even good boys lose their way." Corbin swallowed hard. She studied him as if searching for something deeper. "Tell me, why did you remain silent?" The question cut through him more sharply than he had anticipated. He exhaled slowly. "Because I was afraid of losing her." Eleonora nodded as if she had already known the answer. "And now?" Corbin met her gaze. "Now I know that losing you would have been far, far worse." Something in Eleonora's expression softened, but she said nothing. Corbin leaned forward, his voice earnest. "I don't expect you to forgive me immediately. I don't expect you to come back just because I am asking. But I need you to know that I am not the same man I was 3 days ago, or a week ago, or a month ago. And I will spend the rest of my life proving that to you." Eleonora watched him carefully, and for the first time, he saw something in her formidable composure break. Not entirely, not fully, but just enough. She let out a small, weary sigh. "I should have left a long time ago," she admitted. "But I didn't, because despite everything, that is my home." Corbin's chest tightened. "Then come home." Eleonora hesitated. She reached for her cup, her fingers wrapping around the warm porcelain, but she didn't drink. "You don't need me there anymore," she said after a moment. "You're a grown man, Corbin." He shook his head. "That's not true. You were never just someone who looked after me. You are my family, Eleonora, and family belongs together." Her fingers tightened slightly around her cup. Corbin took a slow breath. "And if you still wish to leave, if you decide you do not want to come back, I will understand. But I needed to tell you this. I needed you to hear it." The silence stretched between them again, heavy with unspoken history, but no longer suffocating. Then, slowly, Eleonora sighed. She set her cup down, meeting his gaze with something warmer, something that looked like hope. "Finish your tea," she murmured. "Then we'll see." Relief washed over Corbin in a powerful wave, but he didn't rush it. He simply nodded, lifting his own cup, savoring the warmth, the familiarity, and the quiet understanding that now filled the small room. When they left the cottage together a short time later, the road back to the estate didn't seem quite as long. The house was waiting, and this time it would finally be whole again.